Open book her true story from Portland. The day my daughter-in-law shut the door, life opened another. She gave her son everything, a home, her love, her health. But when she came back from the hospital, her daughter-in-law had changed the locks. That was the moment she realized sometimes family becomes strangers, and strangers become family. An elderly mother returns from the hospital expecting warmth, only to find her daughter-in-law has locked her out of her own home. Betrayed, she embarks on a painful journey of survival, rediscovery, and unexpected redemption. The lock on my own door. The rain was falling the way it always seemed to in Portland. Soft, steady, soaking everything it touched until the whole city gleamed under streetlights. I stood at the curb in front of my house, clutching a small hospital bag, my knees weak from the 3 weeks I'd just spent recovering from a heart attack. That house, it wasn't just wood and paint. It was the place where my late husband, Paul, and I had raised our only son, David. It was where birthdays were celebrated, where the smell of Thanksgiving turkey filled every corner, where laughter had echoed long before Melissa, my daughter-in-law, ever became part of our lives. My chest ached, but not from my surgery. From fear. From longing. From hope that I'd be welcomed back with open arms. The roses I had planted still bloomed, drooping with raindrops. The rocking chair still waited on the porch, as if expecting me. My heart lifted for just a moment. Home. I walked up the steps, fishing the familiar brass key from my coat pocket. My hand trembled as I slid it into the lock. Turned. Nothing. I tried again. Twisted harder. My heart skipped. The key didn't fit. At first, I thought it was just me, my weak hands, the rain making everything slippery. But no. The truth hit me like a punch in the chest. The lock had been changed. Hello. My voice cracked as I knocked, lightly at first, then harder. It's me, Mom. I'm home. Footsteps echoed inside. Relief washed through me. They were here. They would open the door. The knob turned, and the door cracked an inch. Melissa's face appeared in the gap. Perfectly composed, not a trace of surprise or joy. Just calm, almost smug. You changed the lock, I whispered. Melissa folded her arms across her chest, blocking the doorway like a guard. Yes. We had to. It's not safe for you to be living here anymore. You need rest, care, structure. It's better this way. Her tone was flat, almost rehearsed. Better. For who? This is my home, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I've lived here for 30 years. Behind her, through the narrow opening, I saw him. My son. My David. He sat on the couch, staring at the TV as though it were the most fascinating thing in the world. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. David, I called, my voice breaking. Tell her. Tell her this is my house. That I belong here. He didn't move. Didn't look at me. His shoulders sagged, his silence cutting deeper than any knife. Melissa sighed like she was speaking to a stubborn child. We'll bring your things to you. There's a senior community apartment opening near St. John's. It's safer. You'll thank us eventually. Her words blurred in my ears, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I shook my head, rain dripping into my eyes. No. No, you can't just... But before I could finish, she closed the door. The sound of the lock sliding into place was final, like a nail hammered into a coffin. I stood there on the porch, clutching my hospital bag, staring at the door I had once opened 1,000 times with ease. A door that had led to birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, long nights waiting for my husband to come home from work. Now it was just wood. A barrier. A wall between me and everything I thought I still had. My legs trembled, and I sank down onto the porch step. The rain soaked through my thin coat, my slippers, my hair. But I didn't care. The cold didn't matter. What mattered was the realization settling over me like a storm cloud. I no longer had a home. Flashback, when home meant love. I closed my eyes, and memories pulled me back. David, age 5, running through this very yard with a toy truck in his hand. His laughter like bells. Paul grilling burgers, smoke curling into the summer sky. Me sitting on this porch swing, holding a glass of lemonade, my heart full because my family was whole. We didn't have much money, but we had love. And that love was enough. But Paul had died when David was only 17. I remembered the way David cried into my lap, swearing he would always take care of me, swearing he would never let me be alone. What happened to that promise? A walk in the rain. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the chill forced me up. My slippers squelched on the wet sidewalk as I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood. Portland was alive with its usual mix of beauty and grit. Cafes glowed with warm light, bicycles zipped past, the smell of coffee drifted from a corner shop. But all I felt was the sting of betrayal. Neighbors' windows glowed with family dinners, shadows moving behind curtains. And me? I was a ghost. My chest tightened. I pressed a hand to my sternum, praying I wasn't about to collapse right there in the street. I had just survived a heart attack. I couldn't afford another. I made it as far as Powell Boulevard before I ducked under an awning to catch my breath. A bus roared past, splashing water onto my feet. I leaned against the wall, gasping, whispering, "Why, David? Why?" But no one answered. A friend's door. Finally, I remembered someone who might help, an old neighbor, Mrs. Larson, who lived a few blocks over. My legs screamed with every step, but I forced myself onward. When she opened her door, her eyes widened. "Oh my Lord, you're drenched. Come inside, quick." I collapsed onto her couch, shivering. She brought me a blanket, hot tea, and that rare gift, kindness. When I told her what happened, her mouth tightened. "That girl," she muttered. "I never trusted her. But your own son? That's—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure something out." I wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was cry into the blanket, the sound of rain tapping the windows like the world was weeping with me. Alone in the dark. That night, lying on a stranger's couch that felt more like home than my own, I stared at the ceiling. I thought about the doctors who had told me how lucky I was to survive. I thought about how I had promised myself that once I got out of the hospital, I'd save her life, cherish family, hug David tighter. But now, for the first time since that heart attack, I wished I hadn't survived. The worst pain wasn't in my chest. It was in my heart. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. Sometimes the people you love most are the ones who lock you out. Strangers in the rain. The next morning, the rain had not stopped. Portland skies hung low and heavy, gray clouds pressing against the city like a weight no one could shake. I sat at Mrs. Larson's kitchen table, clutching a mug of coffee, as if its warmth alone could keep me alive. She had offered me toast, but I couldn't eat. My stomach was twisted into knots. Every sip of coffee tasted like ashes because I knew that, just a few blocks away, my son and daughter-in-law were living inside my house. The house I'd scrubbed on my knees, the one I'd patched after every winter storm, the one I'd mortgaged twice to keep David in college when money was short. Now I was here, an old woman wearing borrowed slippers, staring out at a world that no longer wanted me. Mrs. Larson reached across the table, patting my hand. "You can stay as long as you need, dear." But she hesitated. "You know, at some point you'll need something more permanent." "I'm not sure how long I can." I nodded. She didn't need to explain. Her daughter was moving in with 2 small children soon. Her little bungalow barely had room for one extra guest. I couldn't make this my refuge forever. "I'll manage," I whispered, though the truth was, I had no idea how. The streets of Portland. Later that day, I set out again. The rain had calmed to a mist, but the city still smelled of wet asphalt and pine. Powell Boulevard buzzed with traffic, the light rail clattered in the distance, and neon signs flickered awake for the night crowd. I wandered without direction. My feet took me downtown, past food carts selling steaming bowls of pho and tacos wrapped in foil. People rushed by with umbrellas, their conversations blending into the hum of the city. I wanted to scream at them, "Do you see me? Do you know what just happened to me?" But no one looked. To them, I was just another old woman moving too slowly on the sidewalk, someone to dodge as they hurried to work or dinner. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. My body begged me to stop, but I had nowhere to go. That's when I noticed the shadows under the Burnside Bridge. Figures huddled against the cold, wrapped in sleeping bags and worn coats. A fire burned inside a metal barrel, orange light flickering against concrete pillars. For a moment, I hesitated. I had never been the kind of woman who stepped under bridges at night. But something pulled me forward, maybe desperation, maybe the need to not be invisible anymore. Meeting Carl. "Hey there," a voice called out. I turned and saw a man about my age, his beard streaked with gray, his jacket frayed at the sleeves. He held out a worn blanket. "You look like you could use this." I must have looked surprised because he chuckled. "Don't worry, I washed it." "Well, mostly. Name's Carl." I took the blanket, the fabric damp but warm. "Thank you," I whispered. He shrugged. "We all lose something. House. Family. Job. You ain't the first. Won't be the last." His words should have scared me, but instead they comforted me. Here, among these strangers in the rain, I wasn't the only one who had been cast aside. That night, I sat by the fire with Carl and a few others. One woman told me she had been a nurse until medical bills from her own illness bankrupted her. Another man said his kids had stopped speaking to him after he couldn't keep up with mortgage payments. Their stories echoed my own in different keys. Family lost. Promises broken. Locks changed. I realized then, I wasn't as alone as I thought. The church on 82nd. The next morning, Carl nudged me awake. "Come on. There's a church on 82nd. They give hot meals, no questions asked. Pastor's real kind. You'll like her." I followed him, my hospital bag slung over my shoulder. The church was a small brick building, nothing fancy, but when I stepped inside, the warmth nearly brought me to tears. The smell of coffee and soup filled the air. Volunteers moved between tables, serving plates of food to people who looked like they hadn't been smiled at in weeks. That's when I met Pastor Evelyn. She was in her 50s, her hair tied back in a bun, her eyes sharp but kind. She handed me a tray with soup and bread, then sat down across from me. "You're new," she said simply. I nodded, unable to speak. Tears stung my eyes. She didn't press. She just let me eat, then asked, "What happened?" And for the first time, I told someone the whole story. The hospital stay. The changed locks. Melissa's cold voice. David's silence. The way my life had vanished in one cruel moment. Pastor Evelyn listened without interruption, her face unreadable, but her eyes filled with fire. "They shut you out?" she said finally. "Then we'll open another door." Her words landed in my chest like a promise. A shelter, a beginning. With Pastor Evelyn's help, I found a place in a women's shelter not far from the church. The building was old, paint peeling in places, but inside it was alive with voices and laughter. Women of all ages filled the bunks, some young, some older than me. The first night, I lay awake listening to their stories. One woman, Maria, had fled an abusive marriage. Another, Linda, was a grandmother whose children had taken her house just like mine. When I told them what happened to me, there was no judgment, no disbelief. Only nods of recognition. "Families can be cruel," Linda said softly. "But here, we're our own family." Her words soothed me. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt something I thought I had lost forever, belonging. Rediscovering myself. Days turned into weeks. At first, I felt useless, drifting like a leaf on water. But the shelter had a kitchen, and I began helping there, chopping onions, stirring soups, baking bread when donations came in. Cooking had always been my way of showing love, and soon, people were asking for Mom's stew or Grandma's cornbread. For the first time in months, I was needed. Carl visited sometimes, bringing me books he found at thrift shops. Pastor Evelyn checked in, encouraging me to attend Bible study or community meetings. Slowly, I felt pieces of myself returning, the parts Melissa and David had tried to erase. I was more than a burden, more than a heart patient, more than an old woman who'd been locked out. I was still me, a decision. One rainy evening, I sat by the shelter's window, watching cars rush by. The city lights blurred into rivers of gold and red. I thought of David. For weeks, I had replayed that moment on the porch, begging him with my eyes, waiting for him to stand up to Melissa, waiting for him to open the door. He hadn't, and maybe he never would. I realized then that if I kept waiting for my son to save me, I would die waiting. My life wasn't over just because he had turned his back. So, I made a decision. I would not beg anymore. I would not linger outside doors that were locked against me. I would build a new life, even if I had to build it from ashes. And for the first time since that terrible night, I felt a flicker of strength. The paper trail of betrayal. By the time spring crept into Portland, the rain had softened and cherry blossoms lined the streets. Life at the shelter had become routine, morning chores, cooking, sharing stories with the other women. I smiled more often. I even laughed sometimes. But one thing gnawed at me day and night. My house. It wasn't just about the walls and roof. It was about the memories tucked inside. Paul's old leather chair, the quilt I had stitched when David was born, the journals where I had poured decades of secrets and prayers. Those things were pieces of me. I wanted them back. The visit. One Wednesday afternoon, I decided to try. Melissa answered the door, her expression already sour. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady. "I came for a few things. My sewing machine. My photo albums. Paul's chair, if it's not too much trouble." Her lips curved into something between a smirk and a sneer. "They're gone." The words hit me like a slap. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "Donated. We didn't have room. Besides, you don't need clutter like that in wherever you're staying." I staggered back, my hand clutching the railing. 30 years of my life, given away like junk. "You had no right," I whispered, my throat tight with grief. Melissa shrugged. "It's our house now. We can do what we want." Our house. The phrase sank in like poison. The library discovery. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Melissa's face, smug and unmovable, and David sitting silent behind her like a shadow of the boy I once knew. The next morning, I walked to the Multnomah County Library. The quiet aisles, the smell of paper and dust, the steady tapping of keyboards, it calmed me. I went to the records desk and asked about property deeds. The clerk showed me how to search online. My hands shook as I typed my address into the database. A few clicks later, the truth appeared on the screen. The house was no longer in my name. The deed had been transferred while I was in the hospital. The signatures were fresh, David's scrawl, shaky and rushed. Melissa's neat script. I stared at the document until the words blurred. It wasn't just that they had changed the locks. They had stolen my home. Legally. I printed the records and clutched them to my chest. By the time I reached the library steps, I was crying openly, tears dripping onto the papers. Passers-by gave me strange looks, but I didn't care. My own son had signed me away. Meeting Rachel. At the shelter, Pastor Evelyn saw my state and immediately called someone she trusted, a young attorney named Rachel Alvarez. Rachel met me at a small cafe in southeast Portland. She was sharp-eyed, in her early 30s, with a laptop covered in stickers. She ordered chamomile tea for me and listened as I poured out everything. When I slid the deed papers across the table, her brow furrowed. "They did this while you were hospitalized?" I nodded. "Did you ever sign anything?" "No. Never." She tapped the papers thoughtfully. "This transfer looks questionable. Depending on the circumstances, it could be challenged. You may still have rights, especially if there was any coercion or fraud involved." My heart pounded. "But they're my family. How could they?" Rachel leaned forward, her voice firm. "Listen, family or not, what they did may not stand. They may think you're weak, but the law still has teeth." Her words lit something inside me. For the first time since that night on the porch, I felt hope. Flashback, the promises he made. That night, lying in my bunk at the shelter, I thought back to years earlier. David at age 17, his face streaked with tears the night Paul died. He had clutched my hands and whispered, "I'll take care of you, Mom." Always. I'll never let you be alone. Those promises had carried me through the years, through lonely birthdays and quiet Christmases. I had believed them. Now, looking at those deed papers, I realized promises mean nothing if the person making them forgets. Preparing for battle. Rachel agreed to take my case pro bono. She filed a petition challenging the deed transfer, arguing that it had been executed without my consent while I was incapacitated. When the notice reached Melissa and David, I braced for their reaction. It came in the form of a voicemail from David. His voice was clipped, cold, so unlike the son I remembered.
Mom, what are you doing?
Melissa and I are just trying to do what's best for you. Suing us isn't the answer. You need to let this go. Let this go. The words boiled my blood. They had taken my home, my memories, my dignity, and he wanted me to let it go?
No.
Not this time. The courthouse. The day of the first hearing, I wore my best blue dress and the pearl earrings Paul had given me on our 10th anniversary. My knees trembled as I walked into the Multnomah County Courthouse, but Rachel was at my side, steady and confident. Across the aisle sat Melissa, her hair perfect, her smile tight. David beside her, eyes down, avoiding mine. When the judge asked if I contested the deed transfer, I stood slowly and said, "Yes, Your Honor. I never signed away my home. I never agreed to this. It was taken from me when I was too sick to fight." My voice shook, but I didn't care. The truth had power. Melissa whispered furiously to her attorney. David still wouldn't look up. The judge frowned, tapping his pen. "We'll need to review the circumstances of this transfer. If there's evidence of fraud or undue influence, this deed may not hold." It was only the first step, but it was enough. For the first time, Melissa's confident mask cracked. The fire inside. That night, as I walked back to the shelter, the city lights glowed brighter than I'd ever seen. I felt alive again, blood rushing in my veins, determination burning in my chest. I wasn't just an old woman tossed aside. I was a fighter, and I would not rest until justice was done. My new home, my new family. The legal battle dragged on for months. Spring gave way to summer, and summer slipped into the damp embrace of autumn. Portland kept raining, as it always does, but the seasons in my heart were changing too. Each hearing was grueling. Melissa strutted into the courtroom like it was her personal stage, her lips painted sharp red, her voice laced with venom. She spun tales about how I had wanted to sign over the house, how she and David had only been protecting me from myself. David sat silent beside her, his face pale, his hands clasped. He avoided my gaze every time I looked at him. The boy I had raised, the man I had believed would protect me, gone. In his place was a stranger, shackled by Melissa's grip. But I wasn't alone. Rachel fought like a lioness. She dismantled every false claim with calm precision, wielding evidence like a blade. My medical records proved I had been sedated during the alleged signing. Handwriting experts testified that the signature wasn't mine. The truth cut through Melissa's lies piece by piece. By the third hearing, even the judge's expression had shifted. His tone toward me softened, toward Melissa sharpened. And then, finally, came the ruling. The verdict. I stood in the packed courtroom, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. The court finds sufficient evidence of fraud and undue influence in the transfer of property, the judge declared. The deed is void. Ownership of the house is hereby restored to Mrs. Margaret Thompson. The words washed over me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. My knees nearly buckled, but Rachel caught my arm, steadying me. Melissa gasped, her face twisting. "This isn't fair. We took care of her." The judge's gavel struck. "Enough, Mrs. Richards. This matter is settled." Melissa stormed out, her heels clicking like gunshots against the tile. David followed slowly, his head hung low. For one fleeting second, he glanced back at me. Our eyes met, his filled with shame, mine with sorrow. But he said nothing. That silence was louder than any words. Letting go. When I stepped back into the house weeks later, the air felt foreign. Melissa's perfume still clung to the curtains. Furniture had been rearranged. Some of my belongings were gone forever, donated, discarded, erased. At first, grief crushed me. I sat on the floor of the living room and sobbed, clutching the only thing left untouched, Paul's old leather chair. The house I had loved was scarred. But then I stood up and walked room to room. Memories stirred in every corner, Paul laughing in the kitchen, David taking his first steps down the hallway, me rocking him to sleep in the nursery. And I realized something. The memories lived in me, not in the walls. This house no longer felt like home. Too much pain lingered here, too many ghosts. So, I made another decision. I sold it. Not to Melissa and David. They begged, but I refused. Instead, I sold it to a young couple expecting their first child. They walked through the rooms with eyes wide, holding hands, whispering plans. Their laughter echoed against the walls, and for the first time, I felt peace. I wasn't losing the house. I was setting it free. A place of my own. With the money from the sale, I found a small apartment overlooking the Willamette River. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, painting the walls gold in the mornings. At night, the city lights glittered across the water like a field of stars. I bought new furniture, simple but comfortable. I planted herbs on the balcony, basil, rosemary, lavender. I filled the shelves with books from thrift stores, hung photos of Paul and me from decades past. For the first time in years, the space around me felt like a reflection of who I was, not who Melissa wanted me to be. And most importantly, I had keys. Keys that fit. Keys that no one could take away. A new kind of family. Carl visited often, bringing stories from the streets and always leaving with a hot meal packed in a container. Sometimes we sat by the river, talking about the lives we'd lost and the new ones we were building. The women from the shelter came too, Linda, Maria, and others. We cooked together, laughed until our sides hurt, cried when old wounds reopened. They weren't blood, but they were sisters in survival. Pastor Evelyn visited every Sunday, her voice filling my little apartment with songs and prayers that lifted the air itself. I realized something powerful. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the ones who choose to stand beside you when the world locks you out. The letter I never sent. One quiet evening, I sat on the balcony, the river glistening under the moonlight. I took out a sheet of paper and began to write to David. My dearest son, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I cannot carry the weight of this pain forever. I hope one day you remember the boy who promised never to let me be alone. I hope Melissa's hold over you loosens, and you find your own strength again. But whether you do or not, I will be all right. I have a home. I have a life. And I will not be defined by your silence. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it in my drawer. I never mailed it. Some words are meant only for the heart. Full circle. On the anniversary of Paul's death, I walked to the riverside with a small bouquet of roses. I tossed them into the current, watching them drift away. I'm okay, love, I whispered. It took time, but I found my way. They tried to erase me, but I'm still here. The river carried the roses downstream, past bridges and lights, into the vastness of tomorrow. Closing reflection. As I rocked in my chair that night, watching the city sparkle, I thought about everything that had happened. Melissa and David had changed the locks, but in doing so, they unlocked something greater in me. Strength. Resilience. Freedom. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And sometimes, when the rain falls just right against my window, I smile. Because I know being locked out of that house was not the end of my story. It was the beginning.